We were talking a little bit, some of us, a few weeks ago about the fact that, of course, these churches in Southeast Asia, and especially the church at Ephesus, were so vital and so instrumental in the first century of Christianity. And Turkey, modern-day Turkey, Anatolia, as it was called, was just core to the whole Christian movement. Paul, of course, in his missionary journeys, establishing those churches there, and then people from those congregations going and establishing other congregations. We have the letters to the 7 congregations, the 7 sacred communities, but there were many more than that, of course, we know, both in that area, both in Turkey and certainly in the Mediterranean world. But we were just thinking about how critical those were, and then wondering about where is Christianity in that area today. And so I did a little bit. I didn't know really much about the modern day situation, so I did a little bit of research on it, and I just thought we'd just take a minute to share a little bit of that. Ephesus, of course, was home to John, the disciple, the apostle. We assume that he died there, the only apostle to die of natural causes, the only one not to die a martyr's death that we know of. And he had Mary, the mother of Jesus, there with him. Jesus had given him that commission at the cross, and he was very faithful in honoring that commitment and making sure that Mary was cared for all of her life. But it was a very major center of the writings of the New Testament and the workings of the Christian movement for several hundred years. If we look at the whole area of Turkey, what's today Turkey, 2 of the 5 major Christian cities of antiquity and throughout the last 2,000 years have been centered there. Back in the early 4th century, Constantine got so fed up with Rome that he moved Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, there in the northern edge of what is now Turkey. The whole Byzantine Empire is an outgrowth of that movement there in Byzantium. Constantinople today is called Istanbul, but for centuries, Constantinople was the heart and core and center of the Christian movement. Out of the 5 major ones, Rome, Alexandria's in Egypt and North Africa, and Jerusalem. These were the major centers, Constantinople and Antioch in Turkey. And then under Constantine in the 4th century, Constantinople became the Rome of the Catholic Church. In the 11th century, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox, which is basically Constantinople, excommunicated each other. They got at loggerheads and couldn't resolve some of their doctrinal differences, and so they excommunicated each other. And so then we have the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Orthodox, and we're part of that Western movement here. Rome versus Istanbul. And I didn't really know it until I got to looking, but it wasn't until about 60 years ago, 1964 or 1960, that they, in essence, in name anyway, forgave each other and reunited. They're not united, but they overrode the excommunication, if that makes any sense to you. So that's lasted for thousands of years. And then in the Ottoman Empire, of course, came in and conquered Constantinople and all of that whole area of Turkey and the Near East. And they reigned rule for many, many years, hundreds of years. And then in the 15th century, they began a slow purge of Christianity from the region. These, of course, are Arabians. These are Muslims. Between 1913 and 1923, the Ottoman Empire caused Christians to either forcibly convert to Islam, be exiled, or be killed. They had three choices there. They could get out of Dodge, or they could become Muslim, or they'd be happy to execute them, whatever they wanted to do. The Ottoman Empire actually was overcome, I guess, replaced by the Turkish Republic, which is what we have today in 1923. So as late as 100 years ago, Christians made up about 20% of Turkey's 80 million population. So there were still a sizable number of Christians in that area until the Ottoman Empire, and then following that, the Turkish Republic took over. Today, there are less than 0.2% of the population that we know of that are Christian, which would bring it down to something like, if my math is right, that would be something like 160,000. Now, anytime we talk about Christianity in any of these countries where Christianity is not condoned, not approved, or maybe illegal, we don't really know the population of Christianity there. We don't know what the population is in Turkey, because even today, with all of our technology, there are satellite stations that are broadcasting 24 hours a day into all of that region, all of the Arabian nations of the world. And people are, and it's Christian, they're Christian stations. That's all they do is broadcast the gospel 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And we know that there are people who are responding to that message on an ongoing basis. So we don't know exactly how many there are there, but certainly it has become a very dangerous place to be a Christian. In Istanbul, Constantinople is the home of what has for many years been the largest cathedral in the world. I looked up the pronunciation of that. It's Hagia Sophia. It seemed to be the most common way it was pronounced. But it's there in Istanbul, and it's been under mosque control. It's been under Islamic control for many centuries. It was originally a Christian building, and then it was converted into a museum in 1935. And right now, what's the president's name? Erdogan or something like that. There in Turkey, he's in the process of petitioning and trying to get it reinstated as a Muslim mosque. And that'll be another blow to whatever Christianity there is in the area if he's able to do that. So that's a little bit of background on what Christianity has done there in its birthplace almost for these 2,000 years. Our song today, last week we had the Holy City, and it was done by these operatic tenors, and I hope that you enjoyed that. I thought it was very well done and beautiful, but you probably had trouble understanding the words. So I've done it again. We're having the same song again, but I found a beautiful song done by the London Philharmonic Orchestra chorus, but it's the same problem. It was operatic, but I liked the graphics that somebody had put with it. And then I found a solo that was done by a gentleman actually over in Australia. He was singing with the Jimmy Swaggart. Do y'all remember Jimmy Swaggart? he was singing with one of his conventions. And so what I did, I took his audio and the video from the other one and broke about 6 copyright laws, I'm sure, and put them together. But I had to do a little bit of splicing to make the graphics line up with the words. So it may look a little bit unusual to you, but I really love the vocal, and you can understand the words a whole lot better. So let's try that this morning.
One night while I was sleeping, I had a dream so fair. I stood in old Jerusalem, beside the temple there. I heard the children singing, and ever as they sang, I thought the voice of angels from heaven in answer rang. I thought the voice of angels from heaven in answer rang. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, hark how the angels sing. Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna to your King. And then I thought my dream was changed. The streets no longer rang, as with the glad hosannas that the little children sang. The sun grew dark with mystery, and the morn was cold and chilled, as the shadow of a cross arose upon a lonely hill, as the shadow of a cross arose upon a lonely hill. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, lift up your gates and sing. Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna to your King. And once again, my dream was changed. New earth there seemed to be. I saw the holy city beside the crystal sea. The light of God was on its streets, and the gates, they were open wide, that all might enter, and no one was denied. No need of moon or the stars by night, or the sun to shine by day, for it was the new Jerusalem that would not pass away. It was
you could hear the words a little better better that time. We are in the, by the way, if you've been to Israel, you recognize a lot of those aerial shots. You saw Masada there in the Kidron Valley. You saw the Temple Mount. You saw the Judean wilderness and several other places that would be easily recognized. So we're in the letter to Pergamum. We just kind of started it last week. Verse 12, write this to the angel of the church in Pergamum. These are the words of the one who has the sharp two-edged sword. We reminded ourselves of Ephesians 6 and 17. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And that brings us to the comment that Jesus writes to Pergamum about the altar of Satan. The chief god of the Roman Greco world was Zeus. Zeus was the god of gods. As you know, they had a whole family of gods. In fact, when I was a teenager and first was introduced, I guess maybe in a literature class or something, I don't remember where, to the idea of Greek mythology, I got really fascinated by it, and I sat down and I did a long study on it, and I did this whole flow chart on the family tree of the Greek gods and goddesses. It's amazing. It just goes on and on. And it was interesting, and I've forgotten almost all of it, which is probably a good thing. But anyway, it begins with Zeus, Jupiter in the Roman. His temples are all over the Mediterranean world. This one happens to be in Olympia. This is the one in Cyrene in Liberia. Liberia is in northern Africa. This is where Simon of Cyrene lived. This is an artist's reconstruction of the what are now ruins, of course, of the temple of Zeus in Cyrene. Here's the one in Athens. I stood on the Acropolis there, where the Parthenon is in Athens, and you can look out over and see the remains of the temple of Zeus, and there's an artist's rendering of what that probably looked like in his heyday. So Zeus is a big deal. He is at the top of the heap, if you will. He lives on Mount Olympus in Athens, not in Athens, in Greece, north of Athens. Don and I have driven by Mount Olympus a couple of times, and both times it's shrouded in clouds, and I understand it usually is. So it's kind of a mysterious thing, but that's where Zeus was supposedly resident. And Jesus writes to Pergamum, and he says, I know where you live, right there where Satan has his throne. Now, we looked at temples everywhere. But Jesus is saying, Pergamum, you are the recipients of the very throne of Satan. In our video last week, I think Joe kind of breezed over this and kind of left the impression that the reference is to Pergamum itself. And that's okay. But I believe, and a lot of scholars and theologians believe, that probably Jesus had reference to this very specific part of Pergamum, built by King Eumenes III in the 2nd century BC. You can see the excavated ruins there. It's about 35 by 35 yards. I was going to step that off in here to give you an idea of what that was, and I forgot to do it. But it's not exactly rectangular. I mean, not exactly square. It's a little bit rectangular, but it's almost square. And it's like 34 by 36 or something like that, but we won't quibble over inches. It's built on top of one of the terraces of the Acropolis in Pergamum. The Acropolis, if you don't know, is the highest point in any city. Every city pretty much had an Acropolis. It's whatever the highest point of that was. In 1878, a German engineer named Carl Humann was commissioned to excavate and preserve this great altar of Zeus there in Pergamum. And with the approval of the Ottoman Empire, the altar was dismantled and transported to Berlin, Germany, of all places, where they built the Pergamum Museum, which was finally opened in 1930. So all of the friezes, the statuary, the relief carving, not wooden, but stone carvings that formed the base of that, you can kind of see it there. All of that was moved to Berlin, the throne of Satan from Revelation. Of course, while it was there, after being moved to Berlin, we have the rise of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler commissioned Albert Speer to design the parade grounds for the party rallies in Nuremberg. Speer acknowledges that he patterned the colossal grandstand at the rally grounds directly from the inspiration of the altar of Zeus. I'm contending the throne of Satan. In the middle of the grandstand where the bronze altar of Zeus, and we'll talk about that more, stood in ancient Pergamum, Speer built Hitler's podium. And it was here that Hitler stood and mesmerized the crowds and turned them into a frenzy. 1940, Germany joined an Axis alliance with Italy and Japan to make war against the U.S. and our allies. And this all opened the door to the Great Holocaust, led by Hitler against non-Aryans. Lasted for 4 or 5 years. We think about the Holocaust, we think about the 6 million Jews who were gassed and executed in any number of ways, but that was not by any means the full extent of it. That was what was most identifiable, I guess, but his intention of purging the world from undesirables extended far beyond just the Jews, and the 6 million is just the beginning number of that great Holocaust. In 1948, the Russians confiscated the altar, the pertinent parts of the altar, the frieze, the sculpture, the altar, and they took it to Russia. And while it was in Russia, Joseph Stalin rose to power. Estimated that Stalin killed as many as 20 million people directly or indirectly through famine, forced labor camps, collectivization, and executions. I don't know that there's a direct correlation between Hitler and Stalin and the throne of Satan, but it's a fact that it was there. You can draw your own conclusions. They returned the altar to Germany as a so-called goodwill gesture after the war in 1958, and it was reinstated in the museum that they had there. If you go today, you can't see it. They're in the process of restoring it, refurbishing it, and they plan to open it again in the year 2023. You can get an idea of the size of it there in the bottom left-hand picture. You can see the people standing there on the steps, and then those are some of the frieze, the sculpture that adorn the throne of Satan. Right there in Pergamum, right there where that sacred community was trying to thrive. Verse 13 says, "You have clung on to my name and have not denied my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness." And when you see the word witness, of course, that's the Greek word, which is almost identical to our English transliteration of the Greek word, which is the word martyr. My faithful witness who was killed in your midst in the dwelling place of the Satan. That picture there is where the throne of Satan existed. You can see what it looks like today. There's just the trees and the excavation. We don't know anything about Antipas. In the video you saw last week, Joe implied that he may have been killed by a sword and talked about the two-edged sword being held by the person leading the procession to the execution point. A lot of people believe, and I'm among this group, that he probably wasn't killed by the sword. He was probably killed on the throne of Satan, in the altar of Satan. They have this bronze bull, and they would take the victim and they would place him inside the bull. And they would tie him in such a way that his head would go into the head of the bull. And then they would light a huge fire under the bull, and as the fire heated the bronze, the person inside the bull would slowly begin to roast to death. And as the victim would begin to moan and cry out in pain, his cries would echo through the pipes in the head of the bull, so it seemed to make the bull come alive. Now that's pretty gross. But we're talking about the throne of Satan. And this is what Jesus is acknowledging as he writes to the church in Pergamum. That was his commendation. He has also some concerns. In verse 14, but I have a few things against you. You have some people there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who instructed Balak to cause the children of Israel to stumble, making them eat idol food and indulge in sexual immorality. You know the story of Balaam, I'm sure. This is from the book of Numbers. Balaam was a prophet, not an Israelite, but a prophet. And King Balak had instructed him to go and curse the Israelites because Balak was making war against the Israelites and he wanted to be victorious. And so he was insistent and offered a great deal of money to Balaam to go and curse, condemn the Israelites. And I guess Balaam was willing to do that, but on his way, God had told him already a couple of times not to do it, but on the third time, it seemed he was going to do it anyway. And so he's riding his donkey, and you remember the donkey kept knocking his leg up against the rock wall. And he was getting real upset with the donkey and began to beat him. And finally, the donkey looks at him and says, "Why are you beating me? Don't you know I've been your faithful servant all these years, and now you're treating me like this?" And he seemed to just take it in stride. He was going to argue with the donkey about it, which may say something about Balaam. And then his eyes were opened, and he could see what the donkey had already seen, was that there was an angel standing in front of him with a drawn sword, and he was about to die. So they go through the rest of the story where God finally tells him that he can speak against Israel, but he has to say exactly what he tells him to say, and it doesn't end up being a curse. And he tells Balak that, and this isn't from God, but on his own he tells Balak that if you want to be able to overthrow the Israelites, what you need to do is find your prettiest prostitutes and send them into the camp of Israel, and the men will not be able to resist them. And when they have sexual relations with them, well, that will anger God, and then God will turn against them. And that was the way that Balaam ended up trying to earn his money from Balak. And Balak did that, and it actually worked. This is referred to in the New Testament as well, 2 Peter 2 and 15. They have wandered off the right road and followed the footsteps of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved to earn money by doing wrong. And then Jude 11, verse 11 says, "Woe to them, they have taken the way of Cain. They have rushed for profit into Balaam's error. They have been destroyed in Korah's rebellion." I don't know if you remember the story of Korah in number 16, but he decided that Moses was using too much authority, that he had as much right to speak for God as Moses did, and he was challenging Moses, and Moses challenged him to a contest to see who God would choose, and it didn't work out well for Korah, and there ended up being the death of a large number of Israelites who followed Korah. This was kind of new to me, and you can take it or leave it however you want to, but according to the Greek philosopher, poet Philo, who lived a couple of decades before Jesus, he said that Jannes and Jambres, and maybe you'll remember those names, and we'll connect them into the New Testament in a minute. But he says that Jannes and Jambres were sons of Balaam, and that all of them were called magi. Now, you've heard of magi before, right? And that this was the source of the information about the star that pointed to the Messiah. Remember when Jesus was born, we say the three wise men, we don't know how many there were, but these magi, these special envoy from the east, came and brought gifts to the infant Jesus. The reference there is back to Numbers 24 and verse 17. Balaam tells Balak, I see him, but not here and now. I perceive him, but far in the distant future. A star will rise from Jacob. A scepter will emerge from Israel. Now, this is interpreted by the rabbis as being prophetic of the time when the star would indicate the arrival of Messiah. And you remember that the Magi said, we have seen his star, and we have come to worship him. So that's the connection here with Jannes and Jambres and Balaam. The New Testament references in Paul's final letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 3, and we're going to cover excerpts from this. You should know this, Timothy, that in the last days there will be very difficult times, for people will love only themselves and their money. They will be boastful and proud, scoffing at God, disobedient to their parents, and ungrateful. They will consider nothing sacred. They will be unloving, and unforgiving. They will slander others and have no self-control. They will be cruel and hate what is good. They will betray their friends, be reckless, be puffed up with pride, and love pleasure rather than God. They will act religious, but they will reject the power that could make them godly. Stay away from people like that. These teachers oppose the truth, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses. They have depraved minds and a counterfeit faith, but they won't get away with this for long. Someday, everyone will recognize what fools they are, just as with Jannes and Jambres. Now, I'm not sure exactly how Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses. There have been a lot of theories about that, whether they perhaps may have been a part of Pharaoh's court, or some think that they may have actually proselytized and become part of the Jewish company and been part of the group at Mount Sinai that brought in the calf worship there. It doesn't matter. That's the connection point between Balaam, Jannes and Jambres, and now Jesus writing to the church at Pergamum. That was a long, circuitous route. Have I lost all of you along the way? So, too, you have some among you who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Now, we've already met the Nicolaitans, haven't we? We talked about those at some length. They were wolves in sheep clothing. They had some very serious doctrinal issues, and they were very disruptive to the sacred communities there in Southeast Asia. The Nicolaitans that we met, first of all, in the letter to Ephesus, these teachings of Balaam, and what we're getting ready to meet probably next week in the letter to Thyatira about Jezebel. I think all of these are kind of birds of the feather. They are all very disruptive, very detrimental to the sacred communities that Jesus is writing to there in Asia. And it seems like one of the common elements of all of them, and there are other common elements, and then there are distinctions also, but they all kind of have this smell of Gnosticism about them. And we know, of course, that Gnosticism was one of the major issues that was confronting the first century church, and that John especially, and Paul also wrote to condemn. And what was so unacceptable about Gnosticism, it wasn't about this worship style, or I like a standing praise team and I don't. It wasn't about anything like that. It was about the very person and nature of Jesus. And that's what was totally could not be condoned. And because of the interpretation that they had, the doctrine that they had about the person and nature of Jesus, the spiritual Jesus as opposed to the fleshly Jesus, they were able to promote a doctrine that said what you do in the flesh makes no difference. You can do anything you want to. You can go into the temple and have sexual relationships with the prostitutes. You can go into the temple and eat the food that's being offered to idols. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is spiritual Jesus. And that was related back to the doctrine of Balaam, back to the doctrine of Jezebel, back to the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. So in all of these cases, we're dealing with very core issues concerning the very person and nature of Jesus. And then in verse 15, so repent. If you don't, I will come to you quickly and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. We've heard that already, haven't we? He's telling the congregation there at Pergamum to repent. He's telling them that you cannot continue to allow this amongst your fellowship. And then he says, if you don't take care of it, I'll come down and do it myself. You take care of it quickly, because if you don't, then I will come and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Very, very serious. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the sacred communities, to the ecclesias, plural. To anyone who conquers, I will give secret manna and a white stone with a new name written on that stone, which nobody knows except the one who receives it. The manna, of course, I think immediately brings to our mind the wilderness wanderings. We know that God provided food for the Israelites for so many, many years. The word manna, you remember what it means? What is it? That's what the word meant. What is it? They couldn't figure out what it was. We still don't know. We don't know what it was. But it was something that kept them alive. They gathered it every day, 6 days a week. And the sixth day, they gathered a double portion so that they didn't have to do anything on the Sabbath. If they gathered extra any other day, it would rot overnight. But on the sixth day, it didn't rot, so that they would have manna for the seventh day. The hidden manna, maybe, some theorize, may have referred to the manna that was put in the ark, you remember, as a commemoration. The Jews still believed that the ark was in existence, not in our present canon, but in the apocryphal books. Second Maccabees alludes to the ark being hidden by Jeremiah. So they believed that it was still in existence. Most likely, I think the hidden manna is representative, at least, of Jesus himself. So much of the New Testament talks about Jesus being the bread of life that keeps us alive, not for a day or even for 2 days, but for an eternity. The white stone is interesting. The word is siphon, a pebble, but it can also be interpreted as a verdict or a ticket or a vote. There are several interpretations, five of the ones that are more common, and we're just going to list these because we're almost out of time. Ancient jurors signified innocence by casting a white pebble into an urn, white for innocence, black for guilt. You've seen that with even the beans in some of our country's history. It was a sign that you had made it to the finish. It was a good day sign. There was a Thracian custom of marking every good day with a white stone. There was a sense in which a tessera hospitalis is served as a token, as a ticket for admission into the marriage supper. Joe referred to this last week in the video where the emperor or some high official would have a banquet, and he would give the invited guests the white stone that had their name on it. And this would be representative of the banquet feast of the Lamb. It was a stone that was given to the victors as a commemoration of their victory, their overcoming. And the fifth one is kind of interesting because there is this thing in Hebrew scripture about the Urim and the Thummim, and we really don't have a lot of understanding of that. There's a lot of theories about it, but it seemed to have been a stone or stones that were on the high priest's breastplate, and he would use it kind of like the voter, like the judge would. A white stone would mean innocence or acceptance. A black stone would mean guilt or rejection. So those are some of the possibilities of what might have been understood by the people in Pergamum concerning the white stone. No doubt they knew exactly what John was writing about and what Jesus was saying. Our time is up. Next week, Lord willing, we are going to look at the city of Thyatira as we move on through these letters to the 7 churches. I think Revelation chapters 2 and 3, in my mind, are by far the most critical part of the whole book because these have such direct relevance to us today. We need to hear, we have ears, we need to hear what the Spirit says to the ecclesias. And I think that there's parts of these commendations and criticisms in these 7 examples that are relevant to every congregation today. Thanks for being here. Have a wonderful God bless week.